binary normative view, the right or wrong binary, reproduced within linguistics itself. There is some research on digital punctuation. So in fact, if you go back to even to earlier work, to work that Susan Herring, among others, has edited and promoted, you see reports here and there about some punctuation signs being underused or being omitted. So people don't use period and comma, and other punctuation signs are overused. So are used excessively. So this kind of observation has been there since the 90s and has often been explained as an effect of linguistic economy, i.e. people type too quickly in the chat, so there's no time for punctuation. That used to be an explanation, or means of expressivity. So you can index how you speak loudly by repeating your exclamation point. But explanations there tend to be technology related rather than interaction oriented. So people explain why periods are not being used by saying that your periods are not necessarily because you have the framing of a little message, so you don't need the period to show that your message has terminated. But with this kind of explanation, you can't really explain what happens when periods are used. You can only explain by reference to technology what happens, why they're not used, apparently. There is a bit of work on sociolinguistic variation and punctuation, though these are papers, you can count them on the fingers of one hand. Again, Susan Herring with associates, Lawrence Squires and others. And what people have done there is to measure the presence or absence or the frequency of use of certain punctuation signs and to correlate that with gender. So Lawrence Squires has correlated the frequency of apostrophe to female writers and male writers of text messages. And also people have correlated the iteration to see whether females iterate more than male writers. So what lacks, apart from only one paper from earlier literature, is this view from interaction, to look at punctuation in a more of an interactional context. What we're doing in Hamburg and what I'm drawing on in this research, I have a couple of slides on that. I'll see to it that I go through that without boring you too much. Is a theory of punctuation that we have in Germany that is presented or framed as a cognitive-pragmatic approach to punctuation by a linguist called Ursula Bredel, and who views punctuation signs as performance phenomena. So Bredel's main idea is that punctuation signs guide the reader. This is the cognitive perspective. So punctuation signs are used to guide the reader to understand the clauses of a text and the segments of a text in particular ways. And this is a performance phenomena. The performance phenomena means that the punctuation sign, either a period or a comma or an ellipsis, instructs me as a reader to understand the preceding chunk of text in a specific way. So if you take the period, which is one of the main phenomena here at stake, if you look at the traditional grammatical description of the period, it's a sign for the completion of a full sentence. All right, the period indicates that the sentence is complete. In Bredel's description, the period instructs the reader, well, this is cognitive parlance, right? To empty their syntactic working memory and continue processing the given sign chain in the thematic processor, i.e. the period tells me the unit is completed. Now go on and make a topical interpretation of that unit. The important thing is instructs the reader. That's the important difference to the traditional school grammar understanding of punctuation. And what Bredel does is she produces this kind of model instruction for all 12 signs of the German punctuation system. So for the question mark, her description is not that the question mark comes after an interrogative sentence, but the question mark indicates a reading activity which consists in a search for knowledge. So the reader that sees the question mark must abandon their default role as not knowledgeable. You read something in order to gain knowledge, but once you see the question mark, you have to adopt as a reader a knowledgeable position, because in the text you have the seek for knowledge in the text. The exclamation mark instructs the reader to process the chunk of text in the evaluation system. So the exclamation mark indexes evaluation rather than facts. And this is why Bredel says utterances without a propositional truth value, exclamations, directives, greetings, are particularly prone to exclamation mark use. This is very useful when we try to find out where people iterate exclamation signs and question marks. You see them often iterated in such utterances without preposition and truth value. Another sign that will be important later on, the ellipsis. The ellipsis signals the need for a complement at the textual level. So once I see the ellipsis as a reader, I am instructed by the ellipsis to see myself as an encoder of information. Usually as a reader, I decode information. I read the information of the text, Bredel says. The ellipsis instructs me to become an encoder, that is to add information from my background knowledge onto the text. I have to fill the gap in the sense. Okay, so my argument is, and in the hope that this is understood, basically, my argument is that this is very useful as a starting point to look at punctuation in interaction, because I think what happens in digital interaction or in interaction generally is that we use signs of different kinds to instruct each other how to process what we are saying. And we do this with intonation. In face-to-face communication, we do this with gesture, we do this with lexical choice, we do this with different non-referential signs. So the idea is that this framework enables us to see punctuation again as something that is used to coordinate the understanding process between reader and writer. So the users that swap participation roles within an exchange. So we write messages all the time. Now you're the reader, now you're the writer. And so punctuation signs instruct us how to move on with the interaction. And this ties in very well to the familiar notion in sociolinguistics of contextualization cues. So if you come from sociolinguistics, you know how important this notion is, the idea that people deploy signs to index how what they say has to be understood, okay? So that is a sort of theoretical underpinning for my interest in punctuation as a resource for instruction, cooperation in interaction, cooperative instruction being the key word by Bredel's theory, cooperation in interaction. The other notion that I frame the research with is style. And this is basically to say that in the sociolinguistic work of style, we have style as an idea both at the level of the individual and the community. And so some of these approaches by Alan Bell, for instance, look at style in a quantitative manner. So style has to do with the frequency in which certain variables are used according especially to the interlocutor. Whereas people like Barbara Johnstone are interested in style in a more qualitative ethnographic biographic approach. So it's the idea that people have different styles of language in the different phases of their biography. At the other end, the notion of style has been used to describe group styles or social styles. So typical ways of using language or linguistic features that are associated with social groups, social persona, and social stereotypes that distinguish, that are different in terms of ethnicity, youth subculture, and etc. So the main idea is that style, and I take this view of style both at the individual and the group level or the social level. So what you will see in the remainder of the talk are ideas, suggestions, and some findings on how to look at punctuation and style at these three levels of examination. The first level is the individual. So the first question is whether the specific uses of punctuation can come to be seen as characteristics for individual people, as idiosyncratic. And I'll give you some examples for that. The second point is punctuation in interaction. So I introduced the notion of contextualization cues, and I introduced the idea that we can look at punctuation as a resource that people use to coordinate their written interactions. So one that's important here is frequency. So if I know that my interlocutor never uses the periods, then her use of the period will strike the eye, will become salient. If I know that another interlocutor always iterates exclamation marks, so if I know that you use always 5 exclamation marks, if at once you use 10 or just one, will have meaning. So meaning is relational to usage by individuals in an interaction. And so what is important here for this interactional approach is background knowledge of the interactional habits of others. This is why it's, so even if you collect data on the web, in social media, it's important to have an understanding of individual usage and habits in that sense. And another point of interest is how a sign is placed in the sequential unfolding of one exchange. So what are people negotiating in a particular interaction? What are people actually accomplishing in as they write messages? And at what point does punctuation become important because of some sort of contrast? And I will show you examples of that. And in some cases, I will show you one example of that. We have meta-pragmatic, and there's a type of their meta-pragmatic, meta-linguistic commentary. So in some cases, people themselves, users themselves, discuss punctuation and so ask each other, so what do you mean now? Why this period? Why this question mark? Especially why this period? And at the third level, so we have the individual level, we have the collaborative level at which we can look at punctuation, and we have the social level. And there I draw on the very useful idea of enregisterment that originates in linguistic anthropology, and it's very much used in social linguistics these days. And enregisterment is a process by which signs are associated to social groups. You can talk about this. So the point is the association of certain words, syntactic expressions, or pronunciations, or for that matter, uses of punctuation signs with particular social groups. And we do have evidence for such association going on in public discourse. So in a sense, I will give you now in the remainder of the time, remaining time, a cascade of examples for these three levels of looking at digital punctuation. They're not mutually exclusive. I think that all three are valid. So punctuation can be understood as something that's very individual in its usage. Punctuation does work as a means to collaborate and to coordinate interaction. And we have some evidence for how punctuation practices are understood in the public domain as being typical for particular social groups. So, and these will be the examples. One thing we need before we go the examples, I'm sure you all remember your grammar and your grammar basics. And this is the sort of classification, again, in Bredel's theory about punctuation signs. So the idea is that for punctuation signs, she calls syntactic signs. That is the main job of these signs is to organize the syntactic structure of a text, period, the comma, the semicolon, you would say. Another group of signs she calls communicative signs because they organize what we would call participation framework and participation roles. So if you ask, I have to answer. If you evaluate, I can second that evaluation. If you use the brackets, what is in the brackets is less important or different to what is outside the brackets, okay? So it's about the participation framework in social linguistic terms. And then she has another group with the dash and the apostrophe and the ellipsis. Ellipsis will be important of, she calls gap signs or scan signs. So the idea is that these signs index missing, something that is missing, and something that, this can be morphological information or missing information that I, as a reader, am called to fill into the text.